In a dystopian world ravaged by rebellion and tyranny, Jessie Bauer stands at the crossroads of loyalty and survival. As she battles against General Waters' oppressive regime, Jessie uncovers the blurred lines between right and wrong. This gripping trilogy explores loyalty, betrayal, and family bonds amidst relentless action and emotional turmoil. Join Jessie on her quest for justice and freedom in a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Escape and uncertainty. Hours later, Jessie was working on the vent just like her mother had done in their previous cell. Adrian had repeated incessantly that Thomas would come, and finally, Jessie had taken pity on him and kept her snarky remarks to herself. She didn't have the heart to speak anyway. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Waters' rejection of all her explanations. She felt embarrassed to have expected any leniency. There was something stony and far too dark in his soul. Next to him, Adrian was a gush of fresh, pure water. Bickering with him had awoken that forgotten sense of kinship. They may have lost years, but he was still her brother. Family was all that mattered, or at least should have. There was too much fury in her. She was angry at her father, her mother, and even Adrian, but she was also angry at the world. Maybe being part of their rebellion would satisfy her rage. Their cause didn't need to have a meaning. She may feel estranged in their midst, but they were still welcoming her with open arms. As she worked in silence, Adrian was standing by the door. He was on edge. It seemed that he couldn't find any common ground with his sister. There was something in her brusque manner and dark outlook of the world that reminded him of Thomas. Just like her uncle, she hardly spoke, but he was pretty sure it wasn't because she didn't have anything to say. It was strange to think that his sister, who was hardly a few years older, could have a dark past like his uncle and those unfortunate souls he had met on his long journey. He was musing about a subject that might make Jessie laugh, but she had finally managed to unscrew the grill covering the vent, and he could hear shuffling coming from the corridor. Someone's coming. They worked their plan flawlessly. Jessie knocked down the soldier and Adrian took up the gun. He had been training with Thomas as well as they could on the road. Timothy hadn't agreed, but he had soon realized that there wouldn't be any peaceful solution to this conflict. Both siblings ran out of the cell in search of their party. They were intercepted and had to huddle together behind some kind of container and exchange fire. Adrian's hands were shaking and Jessie was frowning. "Adrian, give me the gun. You suck at this." "Have you ever used one of these?" He leaned out to take a shot. "Nope, but I bet I could do better." They heard more gunfire coming from another side of the plant. They shared a glance. "That must be Thomas. He doesn't know we're here. You hold them off. I'll go get him." She didn't give him any chance to disagree as she darted off towards the voices. "Waters," she heard his voice pleading with Thomas, and a shiver ran down her spine. They were so close. She made herself small as she saw them fighting and arguing. This wasn't the poised general nor the suave lover, but rather the broken man she had sometimes glimpsed in the darkness of his bedroom. She didn't move from her corner as she spied their conversation. Waters laughed, and then she heard her uncle speaking again. "I'm sorry I didn't kill you the last time." She clenched her teeth. That wasn't good. She wasn't sure whether she should scramble back to Adrian or witness these two brothers hacking at each other. But the truth was that, even if Adrian was calling her back, she wouldn't have budged. She was discovering her uncle in a light that Adrian knew nothing about. He had told her about his kindness in spite of his gruff behavior, and his human side that, according to Adrian, could never be found in Waters. And yet here, she was witnessing how cruel her uncle could be. No wonder Waters had suspected her of being a trick. Her heart sank when she saw Waters' face. She recognized the pain hidden behind his scowl. Her attention drifted to her uncle, who was unscathed from their fight. This was the man who had inspired so much loyalty in Adrian and contempt in her mother. She couldn't see anything of her father in him. Where her father might have shown pity, there was iron. "You are nothing to me." Jessie closed her eyes to avoid seeing the next part. She heard Waters' men scramble after Thomas. She couldn't move her limbs. She vaguely thought about how betrayed Adrian would feel and how enraged her mother would be. Her thoughts had drifted back to her first night with Waters and how he had spoken of Thomas. She opened her eyes and looked over her shoulder. There was no point in trying to reach the others. Nobody had told her that making a choice didn't give you any certainty. A part of her was still trying to reason with her stiff body to follow her family, but she could hear Waters breathing heavily. His presence was inescapable. She quietly scrambled out of her hiding place and tiptoed towards him. "Hey!" She had no idea how to call him. She had never bothered to use his name. "It's me." Blood was trickling from his lip, and his eyes were wild and moist. He looked at her as he drew his sword. She raised her hands. "Listen, I'm not here to attack you." "Then what the hell are you doing here?" His mind was already set on sending a chopper on Thomas and his family. He had taken the high road, and Thomas had taken it as an opening to bring him further down. So that was the song now? He felt no qualms in sending a chopper after him since he was a nobody. But Jessie was standing in front of him and looking at him as if he were a human being, a person. He halted to consider her. "He shouldn't have said that," she whispered. Waters' face hardened. "You spied on us?" "Oh, come on. You guys were so loud. I was looking for Thomas." His eyes were throwing daggers, but she kept her stance. "I didn't mean to listen." She sprang forward and placed her hands gently on his shoulders. Her lips twitched as if she was about to speak, but she closed her mouth and kept her eyes on his. He sighed and looked away. "Come on, Jessie. I don't need a cheerleader." He pushed her away and stalked towards the amplifier room. He needed to send the chopper now, let Thomas see what he had done, and just get rid of him. He was blinded with rage, and he knew he had to hold on to the momentum. He had to keep his mind bent on Thomas's words and how he had chosen to answer him. But a hand grabbed his forearm, and he had to look behind his shoulder to remember who was on his heels. "Where are you going?" "Jessica, let go, for Christ's sake!" She reluctantly pulled back and braced herself for his next move. There was no doubt he wasn't done hunting down Thomas. A group of his men came running back to report that the Bauers had left the plant. Waters narrowed his eyes, and Jessie shook her head. "Don't do it. Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't do it." A dry laugh answered her pleas. "And here you are again, Jessica Bauer, thinking I actually care about what you want." He turned his face away from hers and ordered his men to set up the chopper with the amplifier. Jessie's face fell as she realized what was happening. He was going to gun down her whole family hours after she had found them. She ran after him as he climbed up to the helipad. Wayland glanced at her and then Waters, but no orders were issued. The general's whole attention was on this black, shiny baby. He watched it fly off with a triumphant gleam in his eyes. Behind him, Jessie's mouth was open in a silent scream. She would have hurled insults at Waters if only she could speak and stop berating herself for having chosen to stay here instead of running away with her family. He was leaning over the railing to peer into the distance when he acknowledged her. "Turns out you're smarter than I thought. If you'd followed your family, you'd be dead like them." He spoke casually, as if he was merely pointing out something about missing a bus. His gaze wandered off once more to the distance with a sneer, as if he could see Thomas scrambling through the wilderness. After a while, he descended from the watchtower and ordered detailed reports, reminding them that Thomas was smart, and they shouldn't stop until there was a body to show. He didn't care about the others, just Thomas. Jessie followed him numbly. She sat in front of him in the carriage, taking him back to his mansion. He didn't speak to her. His eyes were dark and guarded. She was inspecting her hands as she tried to make sense of recent events. A flood of conflicting feelings had replaced the numbness. Her anger at her family filled with regret. She had barely had time to mend their broken ties. The short time with Adrian had reminded her of what it was to be part of a family, and yet Ty hadn't been enough to make her choose them. Try as she might, she couldn't make sense of her own actions and the chain of reactions that followed. When they arrived at their destination, she was still unable to understand herself. She was left at her own disposal in the main hall of the mansion, as Waters hurried to some other part of the structure. There were no orders barked about her. Nobody looked at her twice. She was free to leave. She considered the door leading outside and remembered how it had felt. Maybe Thomas was as smart as Adrian said he was, and they had survived it. But she could still see Waters' face as Thomas spoke with measured, well-chosen words. It was their business, and yet it had echoed something in her. Even if she found her family, she knew she would forever be out of place. She regretfully turned her back to the entrance. She walked through the hallways to another corridor and somehow found her way to his bedroom. But she could still see Waters' face as Thomas spoke with measured, well-chosen words. It was their business, and yet it had echoed something in her. Even if she found her family, she knew she would forever be out of place. She regretfully turned her back to the entrance. She walked through the hallways to another corridor, and somehow found her way to his bedroom. There were no guards in attendance, and the door was unlocked, so she slipped inside. The room was immaculately clean. The only thing littering the floor was her box of belongings. She shoved it under the bed. She kicked off her boots and padded barefoot around the room. She inspected the 2 armchairs on either side of the couch, the bar, and stopped in front of the bed. Everything was pristine. After the dust and decay of the power plant, it seemed like she had stepped into another world, where everything was in its place. She sat on the bed with her back against the headboard. It felt like she had been gone for a long journey and was now back home. And yet nothing belonged to her here. She was a part of the furnishings. The thought didn't revolt her. Instead, she sank into the bed with a satisfied sigh. Waters walked into the room, greeted by the sight of Jessie sprawled in the middle of the bed. He stopped to consider her. She was awake. He could see her eyes looking at him through the curtain of her hair. He took off his coat and hung it in the wardrobe. He then proceeded to unbutton the collar of his shirt. He could feel her gaze on him, but she was silent. She had often seen this routine and had figured out that it was his way to shrug off his general persona. She wondered if he did the same thing when he was alone. From what she had gathered, Thomas had left a while ago. It seemed ludicrous to imagine Waters going through this, shedding off his mask for no one. So much power, and yet such a huge and silent room for a lone man. Jessie had never had the luxury of having a room of her own at Rex's, but she knew about loneliness. Her line of work had sometimes acquainted her with those who were estranged from the world and found solace in the pleasure of the flesh. She could have recognized them in a few seconds. Waters had been harder to crack because he was like an onion. Layers and layers that made her eyes sting and made her blind. But now that fear was dissipating, with her eyes washed from too many tears, she could see him a bit more clearly. He may have been on top of a whole democracy, but he was the loneliest man she had ever seen. Her sharp gaze made the back of his neck prickle, and he looked at her again. It was unusual that a slight girl like her would have such an effect on him, but he didn't find it unpleasant. In fact, it was very interesting. "Why are you here, Jessica?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but she heard him. She stretched luxuriously, her limbs curling and splaying out like some sort of bird preparing for flight. She sat up slowly, her legs folding into themselves. "I don't know. Where should I go?" He went to the bar to pour himself a drink. Without even thinking about it, he poured her one too. She got up from the bed, one leg after the other, and came to stand by his side. They sipped their drinks in silence. The housekeeper announced the dinner. Waters nodded to Jessie. They ate without a word, glancing at each other once or twice. Jessie didn't go for a second helping, but finished her plate in slow motion. Her bites were small and quickly calculated somehow, as if she had a plan for her meal. They managed to stagger back to the bedroom where Waters mixed more drinks. His bar was well stocked with the finest liquor available, even though he often preferred something simple like Scotch neat. She took her drink to the couch and stretched her long legs towards the fire. She wiggled her toes as the fire warmed them. They turned pink quickly, like a starfish in water. He was keeping a vigil by the window. His gaze kept on drifting towards her and catching her unaware. She wasn't the same guarded and made-up doll presented to him a few days ago, nor was she the little Bauer dart that had sunk into his skin. There was no logic in her actions, and he could hardly make sense of the young woman invading his privacy. After a few hours, Waters had ended up sitting in the armchair. The candles snuffed as the hour was growing late. Jessie was the first one to make her way to the bed. He heard her unzip her jeans, slip them off each of her legs, and the flutter of her shirt and tank top dropping to the floor. He glanced at her in the glow of the dying embers. She didn't pay attention to him as she slipped under the covers. It seemed hardly possible that a few hours ago she had transferred from one cell to the other. Chaos didn't scare Jessica Bauer, and he was pretty sure she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Despite his actions, she hadn't flinched once this evening. She hadn't berated him again about her family either. He had expected her to beg some more, crawl over him, or at least throw a tantrum. Instead, she had been silent and relaxed in his presence. He had no idea what to make of her strange behavior. He shrugged off his thoughts and followed her example. stripping down to his boxers. Jessie was lying on her side with her back towards him when he joined her. He leaned towards her, his lips brushing her ear, and his nose smelling the warm scent of her hair. She smelled like something sweet, coconut and vanilla, with a hint of something he couldn't quite place. It was soothing, lying there beside her. The warmth emanating from her body began to lull him into a deep sleep, but he roused when she suddenly began to talk. "Thought you'd like to know they didn't find any bodies." She abruptly turned and almost hit her nose on his. "Why didn't you tell me before?" He didn't answer. Their lips were a breath away, and she was trying to read his face in the darkness. "Why are you here, Jessica?" She huffed in frustration and rolled to her back. She didn't answer for a long time. He thought she had fallen asleep. His own eyes were closing when she finally spoke. "You're a pain in the ass, you know that? In fact, I should have left with them. I'm not even sure why I came back." Her hand brushed his arm and lingered on his tattoo as she continued speaking. "It's nothing noble. I don't understand them. Their fight, their beliefs. But you, I think you make more sense. And maybe that means I'm also a little crazy." His first impulse was to swat away her hand, but he didn't move. He just listened to her breathe. She was here. It wasn't an illusion. The warmth of her hand was spreading through his arm, and her body was just a breath away. Thomas's words had got to him, and the loneliness had gnawed at him. Violence seemed to be the only way to shut off the pain and sense of betrayal. And yet, Jessie's voice and words had a totally different effect. She unsettled him too, but in a very different way. "I sent choppers to kill your whole family. I know, I'm angry at you for this." "Then, why are you still here?" She sighed and moved to her side again, to face him. He was like a dog with a bone, and she knew he wouldn't stop until she offered him some sort of explanation. "You're really dense for an evil dictator. Yes, I'm angry at you, but I'm angry at them. Actually, I don't really know who I'm not angry at. Coming back here, to you, is like the lesser of two evils." "You're calling me evil?" "You're not exactly a puppy," he laughed. She eagerly eyed him in the darkness. It was such a rare sight that she wished it was lighter. "Jessica, you've seen what I'm capable of. And I've seen worse." He pulled her on top of him. He kissed her lips, his arms going around her waist. "I'm not saying that what you've done is nothing, I get it. That means no sex. Well, that's something else." Her voice was very low, making his spine tingle. She licked her lips and leaned forward. Instead, he kissed her chin, and his lips trailed to the hollow of her throat. She rewarded him with a moan, and her legs parted to straddle him. He reached to pull at her panties and ripped the garment. They parted to strip off the last pieces of clothing separating them. They reached for each other eagerly. Jessie straddled him again and leaned down to kiss him as her hair tumbled down around his face like a curtain. Since the beginning, sex had been the easiest thing between them. Interacting, talking, or deciphering the other was strenuous. But once it was dark, and their bodies were doing the talking, everything was simple. Jessie slipped off Waters to lie by his side, with her head nestled to his chest. He felt her body grow lax. He wasn't feeling sleepy. His mind was too alert. He knew he was treading on a dangerous path. Bauer's had this knack of getting into his skin, but he knew that there was no trusting them. They were capable of anything for whatever they called the greater good. Jessie Bauer's journey is one of resilience and transformation. As the trilogy concludes, she stands as a beacon of hope, having faced insurmountable odds with courage. Her battles and sacrifices inspire others to rise against tyranny. As a new dawn breaks, Jessie's legacy endures, reminding us that even in the darkest times, there is always a glimmer of light. Thank you for joining Jessie on this epic journey. May her story inspire your own courage in adversity.